Dirty Moderates, those of you who listen to the program know that when I have a chance to indulge some political theory, political philosophy, talk about the Enlightenment, talk about anything relating to sort of the stuff that kind of informed my formative years, I jump at the opportunity, and in bringing authors on, I always want to bring on people not only that I can learn from, but the people that I probably approach the political center of gravity, so to speak, in a different way than they might. And so I wanted to introduce you all to a wonderful author and professor whose latest book is called Left is Not Woke. The author is Susan Neiman, and she joins the program today. Susan, good to have you on Dirty Moderate.
I'm glad to be here.
Just by way of introduction, if you give me a moment, Susan, that you're currently at the Einstein Center in Potsdam. Is that right?
I'm the director of the Einstein Forum in Potsdam, just outside Berlin, and I'm speaking to you from my apartment in Berlin.
Oh, very nice. Okay. And you were a professor of philosophy at Yale and Tel Aviv universities.
That's right.
And your latest book, and before we get into it, I want to talk about your background. So, because I do feel that, and from what I've read, and I try actually not to overread about my guests because I'd like to hear what you have to say. But clearly, you came of age and more in let's call it a liberal, traditional left milieu, which obviously brought you to the point of your scholarship, I'm assuming, right? Take us back to like where you were born and how you formed into this the place that you're.
I was born in Atlanta, Georgia, the product of Yankee Jews. So my real Southern Alabama friend says you were a carpetbagger. You're not really a Southerner. But I was a Southerner in the sense that I really did grow up in the middle of the civil rights movement. My mother was very engaged in it. She wasn't a leftist. She was a good Kennedy-era liberal who did risk quite a bit She worked primarily on the school desegregation campaign.
Okay.
And that was the atmosphere that I grew up in. And at a certain point, you realize that's actually what, that was where my values were founded. Also, as a Jew,
yes.
We learned that, we say once a year, we were strangers in Egypt, we were slaves in Egypt, and our place is to stand with the people who were slaves in the land of Georgia. And that was my mother's view. That was my rabbi's view. Our synagogue got bombed. I grew up thinking that was a Jewish view. Of course, unfortunately, it was traditionally. It's not necessarily the case today, perhaps not even the majority. But that influenced my thinking very deeply. I went on, I had a rather wild youth, which we don't need. I mean, if you want, we could go into. I was very, I grew up at a period when we thought the revolution was around the corner,
right,
and was involved in the anti-war movement and all of that. I certainly went further to the left than my parents did, and remain so. But when I wrote this book, I'm looking for as big a tent as possible, because I think we're facing a worldwide rise of fascism. And I don't think we should talk about authoritarianism or anti-democratic movements. I think when you see countries all around the world weakening judicial systems, weakening freedom of the press, making violent threats to political opponents, we are on the cusp of fascism. And it's not for nothing that I've been living in Berlin for the better part of the last 40 years. I know a lot about the history of fascism. So anyway, I went on to study philosophy. I did a PhD with the great political philosopher John Rawls.
Oh, wow. You studied with Rawls, yeah.
Yeah, wow. He was my thesis advisor. I was his TA. And thinking it would be a good idea, since I was working on Kant as a graduate student, to spend a year in Berlin. I came here in 1982 as a Fulbright fellow, thinking I was going to stay for a year. I fell in love with the city of Berlin, with its possibilities, with its deep sense of history, and stayed at that point for 6 years, a little more than 6 years. Later became, as you said, professor of philosophy at Yale and at Tel Aviv University, where I was recruited to be the director of the Einstein Forum, which is an interdisciplinary international public think tank. And it's given me the opportunity to exchange with some of the best minds on the planet,
Okay.
but also not to be stuck in the ivory tower, to be able to have some impact on the social and cultural and political world in Berlin, and also further out from that in Europe and occasionally in the US. So,
yeah, well, first of all, Left is Not Woke is a fantastic title, number one. Number two, I'm sure that the ivory tower crowd disdained you for using, catchy words, or maybe, people say, oh, don't use woke. What does woke mean? And all that. We're going to get into that. But what you just said is very important. This book is taut and slender, but full of important insights. Your book, because the book is an accessible read for people that need to read it. I always say
that's right. What I was looking for.
Well, yes, and everybody should read it, but we all know we're in niche culture where people would gravitate toward what they gravitate toward, and I think people will pick it up and go, I'm on the left, what do you mean not woke? Maybe people on the right will. But I'm definitely of the belief that having thinkers with a pedigree who can come and distill our moment, because we are on a brink. My podcast was created first and foremost not to support a political party, but to support democracy, because it's something I lose sleep over. I think rightly so.
Yeah.
But I have been saying for the longest time, and honestly, I don't think I've found a book quite like yours, to my friends on the left, that I'm just going to broad stroke for a moment, if you let me. You folks are barreling toward a very dangerous place with your obsession about reducing every single thing to race, ethnicity, and gender. I said, it scares the shit out of me. It feels no different than, as you write about, what many fascists, yearn for or have done in history. And I've been met with great hostility when I say that. Somehow the cause of justice makes them immune from any potential pitfalls or destruction, I suppose. I don't know. I mean, I disagree with them. So I ask you at the beginning, because this is important, what's woke?
I would rather define woke in opposition to left. Okay.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah.
And I think there are three basic philosophical principles that are essential to anyone who's on the liberal left.
Okay.
The first is a commitment to universalism.
Yeah.
That cultural differences are great, wonderful, and important, but the things that are most important politically are the things that human beings have in common,
right,
and not their tribes. So there you have the first way in which woke is not left. Okay, that tribal identity counts more than anything that we might have in common. I use a metaphor which I was rather happy to have come up with. Flesh is interesting and comes in different colors and sizes and shapes. And I'm the last person to say it's not important. But the bones are the things that bind us and hold us up. And they're also the things that are left of us after we're gone. And so while I'm happy to, have the flesh be part of the culture, I want the politics to focus on the bones, because that's the only place that you get a sense of common human dignity and common human rights. So that's the first way in which woke and left are different. The second way is that to be on the liberal left is to believe that you can, in principle, distinguish between power and justice. It's sometimes quite a difficult call to make in particular instances, and certainly there are many cases in which the two have been confused, right? In which claims of justice, let's think about the war in Iraq, where, we want to go and establish democracy, when it was perfectly clear that this was not George W. Bush's mission in Iraq. So I think where the woke go wrong is because so many people have cynically abused claims of justice when they were really making claims to power. Most of the woke collapsed the distinction altogether. And Michel Foucault, who's the most read theorist in post-colonial theory, is a perfect example of that. He thinks you can't make a distinction between power and justice. And one of the points that I make in the book is, it doesn't matter if you haven't read a word of Michel Foucault or Carl Schmitt. They're in the pipeline. They got into the water stream. If you read a standard newspaper, a relatively serious newspaper, the New York Times or the LA Times or something like that, if you went to college and took any course in the social sciences or the humanities, you will have encountered a set of assumptions that come from these thinkers as if they were God's given truths, and they're not. So the second principle of left is, power is something different from justice. And it was a major achievement for people to distinguish them. And we should still be trying to distinguish them. And the third is leftists and liberals believe in the possibility of progress. Mm-hmm. That is often today caricatured as a belief in the inevitability of progress. And that's
a Marxist thing, isn't it? Sort of.
Marx did sort of believe that progress was inevitable. So did Hegel, and so did today's neoliberals. Okay. Yeah. What the Enlightenment introduced into the conversation was the idea that progress is possible. Right. Contrast that with a standard conservative line, which basically thinks there was a golden age and we fell. I mean, whether it was in the garden or whether it was somewhere later on, we got rid of kings and monarchies and stuff.
Yeah.
But it's been a long, slow slide from a golden age. Things might get better when the Messiah comes or comes again, or whatever your religious belief are. But human beings working together to make serious progress in their own and other people's lives is not an idea. I mean, you had it in cages, but it did not become a serious belief until the Enlightenment. Okay.
Right.
So, and the interesting thing is, of course, I know plenty of people who, nobody wants to call themselves woke anymore because it's just become a term of abuse. But right. I know plenty of people who clearly belong to the so-called woke left, who are in some sense working towards progress. The problem is they aren't able to recognize examples of progress when they come. So when somebody tells me that nothing has changed in the United States since slavery, we're still in the same position, or the patriarchy hasn't changed in thousands of years, I'd say, wait a sec. If you don't believe that and I can give you examples of progress, if you don't believe that some progress has been made in the past, you won't know how to make any in the future.
Correct.
So those are three things that are common to liberals and leftists, and I want to make as big a tent as possible. Like you, I'm worried about democracy, and I'm worried about fascism. There's a fourth distinction that I make between liberals and leftists, and that's very simple. Okay. Leftists believe that social rights, things like fair working conditions and healthcare and education and access to culture and decent housing, are rights and not benefits. And liberals believe that those are benefits, something that can be granted by a state or employers, social safety nets, whereas a leftist believes that those are human rights that are just as important as the right to travel or not to be censored. And they were codified in the UN Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. So I'm on the left. I'd like to persuade more liberals that that's the direction we should be going in. But I'm, very, very happy to work with anybody who subscribes to the first three principles that I talked about: universalism, justice, and a belief in the possibility of progress. And with this book, I hope to convince people who I would identify as woke or enthralled to woke tenets, that while they may be exhibiting, they certainly are exhibiting left-wing emotions, okay? The desire to stand up for the underdog and sympathy with people who are marginalized. I share those things too. There's a German saying, the heart beats on the left. Well, it does, mine does too. And I think that's absolutely true of people who make up the woke. But I think they've been misled by a lot of theoretical assumptions that are actually quite reactionary.
Yeah. I mean, your book illuminates a curious movement and progression, no pun intended, of ideas, but a movement and progression of ideas that are, I think, very, very dangerous. And it's this idea that, building on your point, that we really haven't made any progress, but that worse than that, insofar as these critics can define it, because I have my doubts on that, the Enlightenment and its values are actually regressive. In some cases, I've heard them described when I was in graduate school as Eurocentric. And that, okay. But I have my own views. Don't get me started on post-colonial theory. That's for another, but anyway.
Oh, tell me what you say about post-colonial theory. I'm very interested.
I think it's bunk.
And why?
Because, well, first of all, I think in many, and again, it's a lot of layers here. First of all, I think it's ahistorical. Okay, number one, and number two, it does I don't know if it means to do this. It reduces, it marginalizes all of the principles, the universalist principles, right, in favor of a tribal narrative, I think, that is a cul-de-sac.
Well, if you
I mean, it's much deeper than that. But for example, let me see what's saying. When I talk to people, I'm so glad I kind of almost was a historian. But when people say, well, the empire of the United States was founded on whiteness and it's all about race and look at all the murder that I did. And I said, okay, yeah, our founding is very, very troubled. Have you heard of the Portuguese and the Spanish? No. Okay, well, I mean, we have to be, and this is not a whataboutism. I'm talking about in the era, have you guys, well, I mean, that was, so I said, what do you mean? They wiped out the Incas. I mean, they destroyed and they plundered. These weren't white people. I mean, what I mean is what they're trying to do is create an arc of history or depict one, I should say, that I think is really, really, really incorrect. I think, so back to your question, I think post-colonial theorists have a lens of which they view history and progress that actually does not only rejects the Enlightenment, it doesn't put any kind of universalism. It's all really about tribalism, and weirdly that competing tribes all are in common as long as they're not of a certain race. I've heard that dialogue on the fascist right for all time, haven't we? That's just I don't mean it's reductive, but I'm just trying to give it to you quickly.
Well, if you ever want another guest, I have a good friend who I cite in the book and who I've learned a lot from. He's actually an Indian historian who is working on exactly this topic.
Great. I love him.
Yeah. The fascist roots of post-colonial theory.
But your book talks about, the dangers of wokeism as you define it, as a almost as an unwitting ally, really, of fascist thinking.
I agree. I didn't talk much about post-colonial theory because, unlike this friend, I'm not an expert on it. What I am is an expert on the Enlightenment, and the post-colonial critics of the Enlightenment drive me bananas because actually they don't know what they're talking about when they talk about the Enlightenment. So I've
right, and the Enlightenment, and I've had these debates forever, and we'll get into more of the substance of the book in a minute. But the Enlightenment was, as far as I understood it, and you're an expert on it, an antidote to the things they're criticizing about Eurocentrism, wasn't it?
Look, the funny thing,
wasn't that the whole idea? I mean, it's like,
the funny thing is, the whole idea of Eurocentrism as a problem comes straight from the Enlightenment. So when people criticize the Enlightenment as Eurocentric, they are using Enlightenment tools and they're following in their footsteps, because it was the thinkers of the Enlightenment who first made the point that we need to view the world from different geographical perspectives, that we have a lot to learn from other peoples. And the interesting thing is, these guys, and most of them were guys, gotta give them that, but that's another problem we can go into if you want. But these guys sometimes risked their lives to argue that, the philosopher Christian Wolff, big influence on Kant, argued publicly that the Chinese had a system of ethics even if they didn't have Christianity. And for that, he was ordered by Friedrich Wilhelm I to leave his professorship, leave his home, and the entire territory of Prussia, or be executed in 48 hours. Okay, this was not a Twitter shitstorm. Okay, these were people who were risking prison, exile, or worse for standing up for the idea that Europe was not the be all and the end all of value or intelligence or morality or political sense, and urged us to look elsewhere. A lot of the things that they wrote were actually coached from, as it were, from the mouths of a Persian or a Chinese emperor or an indigenous South American priest. I mean, these are all real figures that you can find if you actually look at some Enlightenment texts. So yeah, it drives me a bit bananas when.
And I think an important point of your book too, when talking about the universalist versus tribalist approach, which is really kind of central to your thesis, is that if you believe in progress, and we can define that in many ways, but I do, even as someone in the middle, I'm not against progress. Matter of fact, I'm willing to acknowledge it. I think there's different ways to get there, and I think there's an American, maybe ideal that maybe is what makes it harder sometimes. It's the sort of socialism didn't happen here thing that's been written about, even though it's
actually did.
It did. Yes, it did. It did. But in the sense of in the way Europe grappled with it, it didn't. I mean, you could argue that, but and that's not what my point is. But my thing about it is that if you believe in progress, right, and that the human capacity for progress, how then? And the book had me thinking about so many things. How then can you believe that everything is reducible to race or gender, ethnicity? Because by doing that, then somehow you don't believe that we have human agency.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Well, I mean, how else do you, and I guess political philosophy training helped here, but I'm just someone who's always a thinker saying, well, that doesn't really make any sense. Right? I mean, you're saying, because then there is a sort of inevitability argument, right? I mean, if everybody is in a so-called disenfranchised group that the left of today is speaking about, or the woke, let's call them in your terms, well, then are we doomed? I mean, in other words, right? If it's an inescapable fact that everything is determined by race or gender or sexuality or whatever that may be, well, right? Then is there any other? Are we burning it all down? Not me, but where are they going with this? Where does one go in the aim and name of progress?
Look,
is that a fair question?
Well, it's one of the questions that I ask in my book. I mean, you're preaching to the choir here.
Yeah.
And, it does puzzle me that people are so anxious to reduce all of the things that they actually do in the world, all of the things that make up who they are, that aren't things that they were born with, but things that they decided to do, values that they chose, professions, or whatever creative things they decided to do with their lives, that people want to define themselves by the things that they were born with and that are unchangeable. It makes no sense to me. But again, there was this marvelous piece in the Times today by this man who says, I'm a dancer first and a black man second. And I was glad to be at the Bolshoi for 15 years in Moscow, where nobody cared about my color. I mean, there is racism in Russia, let's not deny that, but it has been a place where Black Americans, Paul Robeson, for example, have said it was the first place he was actually treated as a human being rather than as a black man. And this man was appalled to come back to the States, where what was important was being a black dancer. And, again, he's got to be a terrific dancer. He danced with the Bolshoi, and he's now a principal at the American Ballet Theater in New York. This is somebody who can dance, who's got serious classical training. You work like hell to become a dancer, okay? And I completely understand the resentment. Resentment's perhaps the wrong word, but the anger at being reduced to something he was born as, rather than something that he worked incredibly hard to become. And that's just one example of something I happened to read today.
Yeah, I don't know if you know much about my background, but in my first life, I was a Broadway producer.
Oh, cool.
Produced Hairspray, the original Hairspray on Broadway, and many plays and musicals. And so I was theater and politics were my two loves. And now I've been fortunate to do both in my life thus far. I'm bringing this up to say that in the American theater now, the commercial theater, we're in the middle of, and I'm not active in it anymore, in the middle of our reckoning with the woke, because clearly the argument now is the theater. The Broadway theater, the haven of gay Jews, Jewish immigrants, right? Apparently, I missed this, was the redoubt of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant establishment, right? That had no home for voices on the margins. Because now we need plays of color, ethnicity, gender, sexuality. We must have this many people who identify as this gender. We must have this. Now? It's happening in the regional theaters. Regional theaters are collapsing, not only because of that. I know it's correlative. I don't know that it's causal, but there is a lot of shows since COVID have come out, plays that have been about not the play, but the message, because we have to rectify the wrong, not the wrongs necessarily of justice, so to speak, but in view of your book, the wrongs of power. So that's been roiling. That's a debate that's been running. So I'm using that as a segue to justice and power. Yeah.
No, I know that. And in fact, when I was I was in New York in March for the opening of the book, launching of the book. And I did go to 2 shows, interestingly enough. I went to see Parade because I grew up with that,
Yes, and that's a wonderful show. But that was from another era too. That's not in response to this yet.
But I also went to Hamilton because the tickets were finally affordable.
Right.
And I had seen it on television and it didn't do it. It's a powerful show.
Yes.
Now it's really good. And
by the way, you don't have to like Hamilton. It's okay. You're not excommunicated. Yeah.
No, I didn't like Hamilton when I saw it on television.
Fair enough.
And I liked it when I saw it live.
Yes,
okay?
yes, me too.
And, one can raise a question, of course, in the whole cultural appropriation debate about, why it's okay in that direction and not okay in another direction. But I thought it was creative, good, well done. Yeah. And I am perfectly happy to see more, actors and voices of color. I do think there weren't enough of them for a long time, and I'm happy to see more. But I mean, you raised several questions. One is, are Jews white? When I was growing up in Georgia, we weren't quite. We were sort of on the borderline.
Hitler said we weren't.
Plenty of people, forget Hitler, a lot of people said we weren't. I mean, Americans, until sometime in the 20th century, Jews were not considered white. The Irish weren't considered white, and Italians were lynched in New Orleans. So, these are very fluid categories. And the interesting thing about this whole debate is the lack of historical consciousness and lack of an understanding of these categories are really not fixed. Okay.
Yes.
So that's complicated and interesting too. And all of it needs to be explored and talked about, I hope, in an atmosphere where people aren't screaming at each other or canceling each other. But the publisher of my next book did say, he doesn't even go to the theater anymore because it's all about, what shall I say? It's just become, I don't want to quote anybody.
No. You can generically state it. I mean, yes, it's become, you were going to say something.
No.
Somebody, theater. I've retired as a producer. I now can liaise with the critics, which I know not supposed to do, obviously. And so now they're my friends, and they have to write tons of pieces now on this. And there was a little bit of a Twitter thread going around that didn't actually turn particularly combative, and they were talking about why people aren't going and what's going on in the theater. And I said, audiences have never been afraid of challenging material, even in the commercial theater. You're right. There has been underrepresentation, but there's also been a terrific history of the African-American experience and the Latino experience in the commercial theater. Was it the dominant narrative? No, but the theater has always been a safe haven for those voices. It was never a place when I was there, I could be gay. It was incredibly multiracial, multi-ethnic, and the notion of wokeness, again, this is 20 years ago now, was not relevant because it was a place where everyone felt they could be themselves in you might say, a universalist sense. The play, to the point of whoever you were referring to, now there is an attempt to message, and dramatically audiences know that. They want a story that will move them and challenge them. But when a play doesn't do well and the author goes to the New York Times and says, well, proximity to whiteness, as they say, has destroyed their ability to be challenged in the theater, or they don't want to deal with their guilt. And it's like, no, you did a play that was a sloppy, dysfunctional thesis from Yale Drama School, camouflaged as a show that hectors and harangues. Sorry, I mean, and that's a dramaturgical assessment I'm making. You see what I mean? I'm saying that's not. It does not a show make. A writer's fury or grievance does not a show make.
Right.
That's not the assign. That's not the assignment of the theater.
Right. And it doesn't make a novel either, and it doesn't
make. That doesn't mean there's not a place to go write. A slash and burn. Treatise if you want, of course, but that's not what people are paying to see. So I think the rubber meets the road there, which is to say the argument, to bring it back to your book, people I think feel that it's not our time for justice. I've heard this. It's our time for power.
That's right.
And by the way, the quest for power has foiled many a leftist movement in history. That even if the intentions were good. I mean, it's.
I mean, you're not going to be effective if you don't have some power. But if you don't distinguish between the two, you're not going to be just either. One of the things that troubles me so much about the American woke movement is everybody is talking about historical reckoning, and I did too in the book that I wrote before this one.
Right.
What they actually mean is racial reckoning. We haven't begun to think about our political history. I mean, there are wonderful people who have written books and they're accessible, and I could give a whole bunch of names of them. But when you said there's never been socialism in America, I'm sorry, there was a very
I stand corrected. No, there is socialism, but what I meant by, of course, that's the whole thing when people say, hey, get the government off my Medicare during the Tea Party riots. I don't know if you remember. That's like people don't even know what it is. No, but in the sense of there being an overriding emphasis. The main narrative is not about what you call social rights, that it's about benefit, it always reverts back to benefits versus right. You know what I mean?
It's not just me who calls them rights. It's
no. And listen, Susan, I lived in London for 2 years. I love the National Health Service. I'm for it. Look, I'm not only for universal healthcare because it's moral. I actually think it's better for business. That's not why I'm not saying it cynically. I mean, I think let's eliminate the paperwork and the till and the bullshit, and sure. People shouldn't go bankrupt over losing. This is ridiculous. Let businesses not have to guarantee it. Let's all pay for it, and let's do it because we're paying for it anyway.
That's right.
So there are pragmatic approaches to that, but to the point of the American woke movement. Do you and tell me this I don't know. Is there a distinction between the American woke movement and, let's say, Europe's too big, maybe too broad, the German or the English woke movement? I don't know enough about that.
That's a good question. Because sometimes when I talk to Americans, they think it's all about American universities, and that's completely false. It's
we're nothing if not narcissistic here in our ideologies, right? That's right.
Well, let's say you don't get a lot of news from the rest of the world.
No, we don't. No.
So for those of us sitting here, I will tell you it's not only a problem in European universities, and as far as I can see, it's pretty Europe-wide. But it's not just about universities. It's about what books get published, who translates them. We had a huge debate in many places in Europe over, do you remember Amanda Gorman's poem at Biden's?
Yes.
Yeah.
What was the debate about with that? I didn't know there was.
This is great. So she had chosen a Dutch translator whose work she liked, right. And the person was even identified as non-binary. And then there was a Twitter storm that why should it be a white person? Amanda Gorman's book could only be translated by a woman of color. And they folded in Holland. The woman withdrew it. They had the same debate in Spain, where somebody had already completed the translation. They paid him for it, but they decided that they had to find a woman of color to do it. Germany did a typical German thing, which was to hire a committee of 3 people, one a woman of color. I forget what anyway, 3 people to translate them. So that's the kind of thing that very much happens here. Yeah. And I mean, if I can tell by who has bought the book, it's been a subject of huge debate in Holland, where it was on the bestseller list. That's the first place it came out after the US, but it's already been bought by in Spain, in Portugal, Brazil, in Korea. And this is the one that really surprises me. In Farsi, in Iran. I keep thinking they have other problems in Iran, but that's so those are the places where it's already going to appear before there's even been a substantial review of it. And I'm assuming that all of those places must have a problem with this question. Otherwise, they wouldn't, go to the trouble of translating a book. So it's by no means an American phenomenon. There are differences. I mean, I think the difference is that certainly in Europe, one does understand what social democracy is.
Yes.
Okay.
And that was my point about the difference in America, that there's a commitment to social democracy that is much more of a given, much more accepted than it is here, for sure. I mean,
I always surprise people when I say that Angela Merkel, who was 16 years the head of the center-right German
Yes.
coalition, is far to the left of Bernie Sanders, in the
Right.
sense of what
Right.
kind of a social structure she would take for granted and what no voter would allow to be changed. I mean, this is,
Right. Right. Well, listen, when I was in England, and I'm not taking any position of which party I'd be in, but the Tories, okay, are not the Republicans. Or historically, they haven't been. I mean, not really the Republicans. I mean, I wouldn't say that's an analog. I'd say there's some overlap in what you might call the conservative tradition, but it's not the same conservative tradition. I mean, Burke is very different from. I think there's differences.
There's some differences, true, but the Tories are moving further and further. They're not as vulgar and, kind of out to lunch as the people who are running the Republican Party. And it is a good thing that people finally forced Boris Johnson to resign for breaking the COVID rules. It's almost touching when you think of all the rules that, our last president broke, that his followers don't think he should resign for. So that's that. There's still a certain sense of what decency in politics means in England.
Yes,
is a good thing, but
yeah.
It's falling apart under.
Yes, I know it's been terrible. I know it's terrible.
Yeah, and the selling of Brexit as a solution to Britain's problem. Brexit has made everything in Britain worse.
Everything.
So I don't have a good word to say about the Tories, I'm afraid.
Yes, but no, that's fine. But I mean, also that was also a larger right-wing movement. I mean, it wasn't that Nigel Farage and all these other people pushing Brexit. It wasn't.
But the Tories jumped on board, and they were the ones who rammed it through, and there they are right now with a furious electorate that is getting poorer and more miserable all the time. So
yes, I know. It's just been. I'm going to London Tuesday actually, and never seen the pound so weak. It takes being an American spending money there easy. What I want to do though is I want to jump over to something here, important in the book, and then I have some other questions. Can you just, for an audience that I think is probably less aware than you might think, in summary, who is Michel Foucault? Okay, and who is Carl Schmitt? Who are they? Okay,
sure.
Because we reference them, and I think people, you and I can go into a little session of Foucault for hours, but I don't think people even know who Foucault. I really don't who that is anymore.
Sure.
Yeah,
Michel Foucault was a French philosopher, social theorist, whatever you want to call him, who did important, interesting work discussing the histories of social institutions that other historians had not really discussed, like prisons, like madhouses. He wrote about the history of sexuality. All of that was quite liberatory to historians from about the late 60s to the early 80s when he died of AIDS. But he became the most influential and widely read thinker in post-colonial studies. And I would wager, I have anecdotal evidence on this, if an undergraduate who doesn't study philosophy reads one book of philosophy and the time they're in college, it will be a book of Foucault's. Okay. So that although when I talk about Foucault as the godfather of the woke, people will say, but he, this old hat, and he died in the early 80s. And, but yes, but all of the people who are now teaching
are influenced, sure.
Read his work as the modern classics that one had to pay attention to. So the influence goes very deep. And he is someone who neither believed in any interesting form of universalism.
I know,
was absolutely willing to collapse the distinction between power and justice. He didn't think there was such a thing as justice. And thirdly, who has the most depressing view of progress that anybody ever did, because his view is things that we take to be progress, say abolishing torture or abolishing death by torture, is actually the promotion of a much more subtle and insidious, subtle form of repression. Okay. So that's Michel Foucault. He looked emancipatory. He looked like, a rebel, and he cultivated an image of being a rebel. And of course, to come out as gay, but transgressively gay at the time that he did was, it was.
He always struck me as somebody in his views of violence, as somebody who would have been perfectly okay with the gulags, in the name of what he believed. I could be wrong in saying that, but he strikes me as the far left authoritarian who believed in a certain view, and even if it took force and compulsion to achieve it, they'd be okay with it. Maybe I miss.
So actually, I think you're attributing too much normativity to.
All right. Okay.
One of the things that bothers me.
There's a great academic word, normativity. I love.
Okay,
it.
So let me put it more straightforwardly.
Yes.
Foucault can write complexly and interestingly about a lot of phenomena. He thinks it's vulgar, or suggests that it's vulgar, to actually take a position. Are you for it or against it? Because every time you try to push him on something, that's what he does. Okay. And that, of course, is a tack that's been taken by so many people, certainly on the academic left in the last 30 or 40 years.
The choice, asking to the binary or the choice is somehow inherently a reactionary question. Is that what they mean by that? Or is it?
It's everything's more complicated than that. You know, when you say, look, are you for, are you for drawing and quartering people? This is a great example for Foucault's book, Discipline and Punish. So you really think drawing and quartering someone, in a public square in Paris is better than imprisoning them in this system of surveillance prison?
Right.
And if you ask a question like that to a Foucauldian, you go, it's all so much more complicated.
Right.
So I don't think he would have been a great Stalinist. I think he wound up.
I didn't read a ton. We had to read a fair amount of it. It's some very interesting stuff in there. I thought as a gay man, it was interesting, like you say, to be transgressive. I personally found a lot of what he wrote rambling and discursive.
I agree.
That was it. I mean, it's what there's some fabulous turns of phrase and there's some real dazzle, but okay,
I feel the same way. Just so we make sure to get to your other questions, let me answer briefly who the other thinker who comes in for some battering in my book, Carl Schmitt. Carl Schmitt was a real Nazi. He was someone whose views that basically the only important political category is friend and enemy, and that any talk of justice is a liberal illusion, which is actually, if you look at it, also just an attempt to get more power for whoever is making claims about justice. So this was his basic political theory, that the only political category is that of friend or enemy. He put this thought in the service of the Nazi Party. He was their main juristic thinker. And the even more interesting thing about Carl Schmitt is he's one of the few who never even attempted to apologize for being a Nazi after the war. He retained his views all the way wrong. He said things like, crimes against humanity are those committed by the Germans, crimes for humanity are those committed by other people, and that's the only difference. Okay.
Right.
So I've always been puzzled about why Schmidt has had a renaissance starting in the late 80s among people who think of themselves as left wing. And I've decided that it can only be because of his strong criticisms of liberal hypocrisy. And, I get the criticisms. I agree with the criticisms. When he talks about the British Empire as being a monumental act of piracy that was covered over with talk about spreading liberal values, or the U.S. Monroe Doctrine as being roughly the same thing. The U.S. could do whatever it wants to in the part of the world it considers to be its backyard. So I agree with him when he's saying that. But then you have to look at the date at which he's saying it's 1942. Germany's in the middle of a war against both of those powers. So he is not speaking for the colonialized peoples. He is making the same argument that Hitler made when he pointed to the fact that European Americans had committed genocide and land theft against Native Americans, and so it's fine for him to do it too.
Right. Well, and that so there's two questions unrelated to each other that I want to ask you in closing that I think relate to your thesis. First off, what is your take on the Supreme Court's ruling on affirmative action?
It's a really good question, and
happy to share mine, and it relates a little bit to what you argue, but I'd love to. I mean,
I'm still thinking about it.
Fair enough.
Because I think there are a couple of things that we know. First of all, the ruling really affects a very small percentage of students at elite colleges.
Correct.
And the idea that this is going to open the gates for racism all over the world strikes me as wrong.
And hyperbolic.
Yeah. The other thing is that, which everybody is now saying, colleges are simply going to find new ways of, allowing some form of race signaling to work in admissions, and admissions guidance counselors in high schools are going to be able to, coach students how best to say that you come from an ethnic minority without actually saying it. So insofar as I feel that certain forms of race-based preferences really are racist, I find myself on a side that I'm rarely on, which is to say, I see some good reasons why, particularly when you read things that were introduced as evidence in the judgment. I haven't read all of it yet, but there are some quite racist statements that have been just very standard. What bothers me the most about affirmative action is the way that it undermines women and people of color. I could scream.
You mean in terms of suggesting they're less capable without it?
Correct. Why did Joe Biden have to say, I'm going to appoint the first...
I talked about this last night. I know. Yep.
Because I'm sure that Ketanji Brown Jackson is highly qualified.
Very much so.
Judge, but she will forever have to live with the suspicion, Biden promised some Black woman so he could win the primary in South Carolina. And that's just so undermining every achievement of every woman or every person of color. And the question is how to deal with that.
Right.
And that's what I'm not 100% sure of. But I think as a woman, by the way, Germany is about 25 years behind the U.S. often on many things, and one of them is on sexism. So as a woman who can tell when somebody, in Germany sort of looks with surprise, and I see the light bulb go off, and sometimes they even say it. Oh, you have something to say. You weren't just an affirmative action hire. Yeah. And sometimes people will say that out loud here. And it is so problematic. And I know people of color who make jokes, wry jokes, dark jokes, because it's not really funny to realize that the reason you've been invited or appointed to something or given a job is because you fill somebody's preference slot. So it's a genuine problem. What I'm not sure about is whether this ruling solves. I would be suspicious, frankly, if this ruling solves it in any way. So.
Interesting. Yeah, I've wrestled with this question for a long time, but I did an episode which got quite a few people angry, but that's okay. I have lots of people on the left and lots of people on the right. It's good about being in somewhere in a middle lane. Fundamentally, the question before the court about does this policy violate the Equal Protection Clause, the Civil Rights Act, and does it withstand strict scrutiny? The answer to the first two is yes, and the answer to the third is no. And in view of your book, Susan, when you read the racism that was written in their personality scores of Harvard applicant or personality evaluations, some of them are so grotesque. And the idea, right, that again, with the idea of woke, that we aren't only going to reject, I believe, equal protection, civil rights. I believe those to be universalist principles. Even if the country didn't start with that, I believe that's what they represent. Okay? I do. And if you look, yes. So my argument again.
We started with universal principles that were betrayed in the very hour of our founding.
In the very hour of our founding, but the principles nonetheless stand. So the idea of creating not a universalist category of how we view people, but a tribal one in terms of race and ethnicity. But then in the case of this, overtly using tribal favoritism, saying that Asians can be discriminated against because they're overrepresented in favor of other ethnic groups. Now you're in real perilous territory. You're in the balkanization debate because of historical reasons. Well, there's been a horrible history for Black and Latino people, to which the answer is, but not Asian people? That's ahistorical too. We can't spend all time on this, but the reason I agree with it, that was the question before the court, and they did discriminate and they did violate that, and find another way. That doesn't mean I don't believe that we have not even begun a proper racial reckoning in this country. I think both things can be true. And
I do want to emphasize, unlike people, your right-wing listeners, there was an unspoken preference for white men. Not just in college admissions, but all across most professions. And that's a form of racism that needed to be corrected. My worry is that we have overcorrected in a way that does harm. I'm less worried about, not that I'm not worried about doing harm to everybody, but I'm actually worried about the harm it does to people who've been previously marginalized, and the way in which it sets up all of us to actually have very low expectations of minorities and women, because we assume that that's why they were chosen for this or that, and that's a problem.
Right. Absolutely. Okay. So in closing, the question I want to always ask someone at the end is, how can we, speaking of progress, how can my listeners hearing this and how can we as people do better? What do you recommend? Okay. And this is a bit of a prescriptive question, so let's take a shot at it. That how can people sort of shed their learned identity thinking, origin, tribalist thinking, which we think over here at the podcast is such a key factor to fighting fascism ultimately. what can, because I do have a real range of listeners, and I do have a lot of people who I consider to be moderates. What I know that you're not in the business of giving policy prescriptions, or even but you are in the intellectual business. So
I'm in the business of what we call the normativity business.
The normativity. There's that. I love normativity. Yes, but so what would you say to people because you?
So let me start. This would be a good exercise for everybody.
Okay.
Name 10 characteristics of you that are really important to you, without which you couldn't imagine yourself as yourself, and try just to limit it as to 10.
Right.
So, are you a mother or a father? Were you a child? What is the difference between your fundamental identity being the identity child and becoming another? Are you a lover?
Right.
Is there a particular type of person you love? Is that more important than your professional identity? Is it always more important than your professional identity? Think again about, I happen to be, I'm one of these people who doesn't understand the depth with which many people all over the world identify with their favorite sports team.
Right.
But
I'm not that either.
But billions of people.
Yes.
Find this crucial to their identity.
Right. Yep.
Think about that. Think about the music you care about. Think about whether, the political party or lack of political party, but general orientation now. And then see if you can confine that to just 10 things. Hard to do, because it's usually most people, as they start thinking about what their identity is, you can even take a dating site. Look at the kinds of, qualities that you're allowed to, check off that are important to you if you're looking for a new partner. Think about those kinds of things and which you would leave out. And then ask yourself, are all of those things less important than the ethnic tribe you were born into, or the gender or sexual identity that you have? Just ask yourself. And my guess is that's a way of opening people's vision. And then the second thing I would advise everybody to do is think about the dangers facing humankind at the moment. And I said at the beginning of the show, and I'm glad that you agree with me, we are faced with a worldwide rise in fascism.
Oh, yeah.
Not anti-democratic tendencies, which is everybody's afraid of the word fascism. Right. But if you study what's going on, whether it's in India or Russia or Turkey's on the brink,
Poland, Hungary.
Yeah. It's a huge, and MAGA. There is a rising threat of fascism that can only be countered if all of the people who believe in the things that I set out at the beginning agree to forget their differences and come together in support of democracy. And remember, by the way, as I close the book by saying that the Nazis never would have come to power. They were not a majority, but the left parties opposing them could not agree with each other. And so the Nazi Party never won a majority until it was in power, and then it was able to outlaw other parties and outlaw press and things like that. And so that's the first thing we have to remember. The second thing that we have to remember, and it's not clear to me whether the United States, everybody in the United States, depending on where they live, is actually seeing the effects of the climate catastrophe.
Right.
This is a problem that can only be solved if we forget about tribalism and nationalism and realize this is only going to be a problem if we forget about tribal differences and work on that together. Right. So those would be my, my suggestions in thinking about that. And I hope some people will be moved to read my book. It's short. It was meant to be clear. relatively simple in the style of the Enlightenment writers, who I like very much, precisely because they were not writing for other academics. They were writing for other intelligent readers who were not professional thinkers. And I hope I've been able to add some clarity to this debate.
Oh, indeed. And Susan, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show. Folks, the book is Left is Not Woke. I don't care where you sit or stand on the political spectrum. It's a must read for its insight. And also, I think it's a wonderful corrective to a lot of the misinformation that has brought us to this point. And that informs so much of what I think is not just misguided thinking, but thinking that is putting us on the path to peril, which none of us, or most of the people who certainly I know and listen to this podcast, do not want to be on. Susan Neiman is the author. We will include links to Amanda Gorman's work, Foucault, Schmidt, and of course, Susan's website and Amazon to purchase her book, and this essay from the New York Times today about the Black dancer in Russia, of which Susan spoke. Susan, thank you for joining Dirty Moderate. I will definitely have you back. Can't wait to read more of your work. And thank you ultimately for edifying so much for us today.
It was a pleasure to talk to you, Adam.
Thanks, Susan.